Hi, my name is Oliver Botar, and I'm a professor of art history in the School of Art of the University of Manitoba. I'm making this video as part of the online programming of the Winnipeg Art Gallery in association with the gorgeous exhibition currently on view entitled Into the Light, Lionel LeMoine FitzGerald. The show was installed just as the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown began in March and has been in deep freeze since. I actually went to see the show the day after it opened as part of the reopening of the WAG in early May. What occurred to me while I was in the show is that in some respects, FitzGerald is an ideal artist to think of in times of a pandemic. What I mean by that is that during the pandemic lockdown, which has been strict in Manitoba until just recently, and is still strict, though we can now do some things such as visit the show, under a strict social distancing regime, a lot of us have spent a good deal of time looking out of windows. For some of us, such as those in quarantine, in long-term care facilities, or others of us particularly vulnerable to the virus, the view through the window is literally our only connection to the outside world. And FitzGerald was one of a long line of Western artists who made images, both drawings and paintings, of views through windows. Of course, in Winnipeg, as in much of Canada, our long winters make it inevitable that we spend time looking from the inside outwards. And this was particularly true before the advent of television in the mid-1950s. FitzGerald died in 1956, just as the TV era was dawning here. So he'd have been part of the last generation to regard window watching as the only form of visual entertainment available from home. In fact, born in 1890, FitzGerald would have been 28 when the last great pandemic, the great influenza, broke out in the spring of 1918. 1918 had been a signal year in FitzGerald's life. He himself didn't serve in the army. He and his wife Valley were raising a young family. They'd moved that February to a modest home at 18 Evanston Street in Wolseley, not far from where I am now, at home, recording this at Vimy Ridge Park. His son Lionel Edward was 2 years old at the time. FitzGerald was desperately trying to support them by working as a window dresser at Eaton's on Portage Avenue. He was earning $30 a week, slavery as he described it. Most importantly to his career, he showed at the Ontario Society of Artists annual show in Toronto for the first time that spring during April and early May. He exhibited his painting, Late Fall Manitoba, that he had painted the previous year in the spirit of the emerging Algonquin group, later to be known as Group of Seven, and the National Gallery of Canada purchased it for $275, a small fortune at the time, and the first major purchase of his career. Well, it was that fall that the second, more virulent wave of the pandemic spread through the country along the railway lines. Remember that Winnipeg was the most important railway hub in the West, killing, by the time it fizzled out around 1920, an estimated 55,000 Canadians. Given that this flu mostly felled young adults between the ages of 20 and 40, FitzGerald would have known that he was in a dangerous demographic. And with the birth of his daughter Patricia in March of 1919, he and Valley would have been well aware that the crisis could easily have orphaned their children, as it did many. In any case, it was during that fall of 1918 when the second, more virulent strain of the virus hit Canada, the one that killed 90% of Canadian victims, that the FitzGeralds, like many others in Winnipeg, would have been self-isolating as much as they could, cooped up in their home. While it was not until two decades later that FitzGerald began to draw and paint his great series of window views. At this point, in 1918-19, FitzGerald was still exploring an impressionist style of landscape painting in his work. I can't help but think that he and a progressively more pregnant Valley would have spent a lot of time looking out of the small windows of their modest home on Lower Evanston Street, wondering when the pandemic would be over, when life would finally get back to normal.